El miércoles 18 de enero de 2023 empezaremos el taller en línea, Cómo aplicar el wellness a mi proyecto, trabajo o profesión. Te invito a echarle un ojo en victorsadia.com.
I think the reason the way I practice is the way I practice is because of the art. It's because of the practice of music. I found it fascinating that I've given my life to things that require practice and never achieve any sense of perfection. That the constant work of practice is my day, is my life.
Bienvenidos a Volver al Futuro Podcast, donde platicamos con las mentes que nos impulsan a crear el nuevo paradigma de salud y bienestar, conducido por Víctor Sadia.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we have Rupa Marya. Dr. Rupa Marya is a physician, activist, writer, mother, and composer. She's an associate professor of medicine at the University of California and a co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition. Her work sits at the nexus of climate, health, and racial justice. She's the co-author of the book Inflamed: Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. Rupa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you're a physician who plays the guitar and sings in several languages. You're a writer, composer, activist. But tell me, how did all this begin for you? Who was Rupa as a teenager that decided to study theater and molecular biology?
Oh God, that's a good question. Well, let's see. I was listening to a lot of Pink Floyd at that time. I was, just learning how to play the guitar. I think I started and stopped 3 or 4 times. I didn't really get into it until I was about 19, 20 years old. I was trying to understand how to attend to all of these passions in my life, my passion for understanding the way the world works, my love of science, my love of humanity and biology, the living world around me, the systems I saw around me. And so the only way I could figure out how to do that was to simultaneously, engage in my work as a physician and work as an artist.
I think I felt the same way as you at that point in my life. And, I wanted to work in something that give me that feeling of awe all the time, looking at the big things and the small things. But you soon realize that you have to pick a path in a way. How did it occur to you that even if you're choosing a path, it is a path that has so many paths within it?
Yeah, there was a period in my life between when I went to college in San Diego, and I entered college with so many credits from high school that I could have graduated in a year and a half and gone on to medical school, which I knew I wanted to be a doctor. Since I was a young kid, one of my uncles was a doctor. I was very interested. I can't tell if it was because I was a child of Indian immigrants where, everyone's told they have to be an engineer or a doctor. So it could have been that indoctrination, but there was also just a natural love of people and caretaking. And so once I realized I could go through school so quickly, I thought, well, why don't I just slow down and study theater? And I always loved theater. And through the study of theater, I really found that my interest was not so much in acting, but more in directing and writing. And that's where I was like, oh, if you write songs, you get to not only act and direct, and you get to do it all. And so I started to learn how to write music in order to be able to convey ideas and thoughts that I was feeling and experiencing by looking at the world around me, and looking through the lens of a physician, of a doctor, of a healer. And so it was at UC San Diego where I was really starting to walk this double life as an artist and a physician. And I took a year off before going to medical school to just study music and to practice performing, which I was not very good at. And then went to medical school. And it was in medical school where my colleagues would tell me to stop torturing myself and to like pick something. Like, you either have to be a musician or you have to be a doctor. There's no way you could do both. And it wasn't until I met a friend who was a very, very dear friend, who was the first person in my life to say, why are you even trying to choose? You're obviously both. And it was hearing this aha moment of like, oh yeah, of course I am. That gave me permission to start really looking at what it meant to have a path that would encompass both. When in the last year of medical school, my father died quite suddenly. He had a cardiac arrest, and that last year of medical school was very challenging because of that. I ended up at UC San Francisco, which is near where I grew up, doing residency. And it was after that first few months of internship where I went in and asked my program director if I could develop a track where I would do art and medicine exactly at the same level. And they were like, no one's done that. You might not have a job, but if you're okay with that, then go ahead. And so I was like, okay, I'm okay with that. If I don't have a job, I'll just go tour the world for a year and learn and understand different meanings of medicine. So it was very interesting because it was a time in my life where I could have been very fear-based, and I chose not to be. And it was literally, I think, because of my father's death. Because I was like, you could just drop dead. You might as well do what you think you're supposed to do. And so that leap of faith led to so much beauty and so much complexity in my now 20-year career as a doctor. Yeah, I was just thinking about it this morning, like if I were to share what kind of curriculum that was with the world, I think it would be a really exciting one for medical students. I love the work I do as a physician. I don't think I'm a bad physician. I think I'm a pretty good doctor. My patients seem to be happy with the care that I give them. But in addition to, I think the reason the way I practice is the way I practice is because of the art. It's because of the practice of music. I found it fascinating that I've given my life to things that require practice and never achieve any sense of perfection, that the constant work of practice is my day, is my life.
Beautiful. And I think that's the thing. We do think that they are two separate things, but when we practice them together, it feels like if music is medicine and medicine is music and all the other things. At what point did you start to realize that it wasn't just making that having all these other identities was making you a better doctor?
I mean, it was something as simple as, when I was in residency and I agreed to do it exactly half, I would go away for 2 months, like hand my pager off, go on the road for 2 months with my band, come back, pick up my pager, and I'd be focused for 2 months in the hospital. And my patients would invariably say, there's something different about you. I'm like, yeah, because when I'm here, I'm so excited to be here because I know I'm going to leave and do something equally awesome for 2 months that nurtures me. And there'd be times where I would be on stage singing to a bunch of people or in a tiny room, didn't matter. And I would be singing these songs that I had written that had been coming out of my experiences from being a doctor, coming out of the beautiful teachings that our patients give us. And as I would be singing them, I would realize how the song itself was healing me. It was giving me a space to reflect on what I had experienced. It was giving me a space to integrate it into my body, into my life, and also a way to honor the patients who were teaching me with their very lives what medicine is, how to practice medicine, and how to be, a caring physician and a healer. And so that to me was, it was both in the reflections of my patients being like, whoa, what's different about you? What is that je ne sais quoi, what is that thing? And what they were feeling was my joy of being there. What they were feeling was that I was carrying my multitudes of myself into that space. And that through that acceptance of who I was in my complexity, I accepted them in their complexity, that I would not reduce them to, an other or a being that has no humanity. So in the accepting and the insistence upon our own humanity, as physicians, I believe we become better at holding the complexity of other people's.
Sure. And what we're seeing is also that, as we see that the health problems that we are experiencing is not just byproduct of faulty machines that we can just fix with drugs or surgery, and it's more like a systemic thing. The identity of the health professional must also encompass all the other identities as policymakers, as artists, as fathers and mothers, as even chefs, and people working in the soil. And I think it's again giving us a permission, but also we have now the necessity of doing that. It's not only about just expressing all the things that we would like to do, but the world demands that we work from that complexity into that complexity.
And it's also the limitations of our medical education, which from the colonial capitalist framework really focuses on the individual, shorn from their cultural, social, political, historical context, even their families. So like you're looking at individuals as if that is a real thing. And we focus in on individual diseases, individual genes, what the individual can do. They can fix their diet and lifestyle, but in fact, what we're learning more is that the diseases that we're faced with treating, chronic inflammatory diseases, are so much the outcome of how systems interact around the body, around people's bodies. And so if we want to be effective at treating those diseases, we have to start working on the level of the systems. And to work at that level, it's important to understand how we ourselves are situated within those contexts, who we are within those contexts, where we have power to exert change, where we don't have power, where we have to amass and create and organize power. And so those kinds of analyses become really critical if we want to have change, if we want to change the actual outcomes for populations of people. Or even for individuals, because, we just saw a paper come out that said there's going to be a 700% increase in the rise of diabetes in young people in the United States. That's not a bunch of young people making bad choices. That's the failure of or the toxicity of a food system structure and a structure of capitalist arrangements of power that will dictate how people get sick. And so if we want to change that as healthcare providers, if we don't want to see that many people suffer in those ways, we have to get conversant, we have to get literate, we have to get engaged with who we are in those systems and how we can participate in changing them.
So I hear I love your tone of voice in this conversation, but I've also read and heard you talk about these things from more from an outraged, or I don't know if that's the word, but very vocal about this inflammation that we're living. How did you begin thinking about inflammation, and how inflammation is not only a call to action, but a deep sense of acknowledging that our cosmology is not as amazing as we've come to believe in the last 3-4 centuries in the West, obviously?
Yeah. Well, for me, it really was the outcome of spending time between touring as a musician and being in communities where you could see the interaction between social structures and health really clearly, who was getting sick and how people were getting sick. And then coming back to the hospital and seeing those same patterns recreated within the social milieu of where I live in San Francisco, occupied unceded Ohlone territories. And so once you start paying attention, for me, as I'd say like 15 years ago, I started noticing, wow, these people in Ireland really have the same kinds of problems as the people on that Indian reservation in Navajo, Dene territory. And those people kind of have similar profile to these people in the slums of Ahmedabad, India. And what does that have to do with what's going on in the Zapatista territories, these autonomous zones in Mexico and the indigenous communities there? And so you start to think about these things and look at these patterns of diseases And what I started to think of was that there was this, I called it a syndrome of colonized people. That's what I started to say about 15 years ago. It's like, it's almost like people are carrying like a syndrome where it's affecting the body, and you're seeing more diabetes, you're seeing more autoimmune, like rheumatoid arthritis, you're seeing more of these things. And what we come to find out, in the last 10 years is that all of these diseases have in their pathogenesis the activation of systems of chronic inflammation. And so what is it about those societies that are predisposing people to chronic inflammatory disease? And that was really the premise of the book that I wrote with Raj Patel, was looking at how social structures and the sum of exposures of one's life, which includes their environments, the pollution that they're exposed to, as well as whether their neighborhoods are being over policed, or whether they're being forced to work the night shift, or whether they have histories of intergenerational histories of land theft or enforced labor. So these kinds of things are imprinted on the body and predispose people's bodies to different levels of inflammatory reaction. And so when you see that, you see like the immune system is really working the way it's supposed to work, which is in some way great, because now we know how to true our wheel, right? So if like we're seeing certain populations predisposed to larger amounts of chronic inflammatory disease, that means that we have to tweak those social structures. It doesn't mean that we just offer them more metformin or more of the latest immunomodulating therapy. And so it's exciting because it shows that there are ways to transform things that aren't as expensive. They are more, you could say, wholly transformative, which is going to take more activation energy to change, to shape dynamics of power differently. But that in fact it doesn't require a huge bill or big pharma to get involved in the same way it requires us organizing together to make sure people have the circumstances they need to be healthy and well.
Yeah, and it all comes, or ideally it comes with a huge doses of humility and of a willingness to unlearn what we've been preaching for several centuries, that science and technology and industry and capitalism will save us from death, will save us from aging, will save us from disease. And yes, we've progressed a lot, but we also in a sense the problems we're facing today are the solutions of yesterday. How to reconcile these inherent, I guess, outrage of what we've done with ancestral knowledge, ancestral communities, indigenous worlds, and reinvite those knowledges without sounding paternalistic or pluralistic or open. It's really, I think it's a very delicate thing. Here in Mexico, as in many countries that have been colonized, is a debate that has been raging over, well, not a lot of time. It's kind of recent, but how to reconcile two worldviews or different worldviews when we don't share the same language, I guess.
That's a really important question, and I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. I think it's very specific to the communities that people are working with and living with. And here in this area, there are some folks who are indigenous and very culturally connected. There are most folks who aren't very culturally connected. So the parts of those communities that are becoming reconnecting, that is their own path. That is their own specific healing that's happening, that must be protected and supported, but not interfered with or co-opted, or even it's not time for those people to be involved in that kind of discussion until they're ready. However, there are people who are still really culturally connected and are very interested in bridging different ways of knowing and creating spaces where there can be a sharing of information and knowledge in a way that advances health and well-being for all. And that, I think, is really the exciting edge when folks are ready, and if they're ready and how they're ready. But again, those things have to be dictated by certain protocols where that knowledge is not then extracted from, which is, that how Western science and Western medicine have worked historically. And so developing practices, where communities can come together in a shared desire for better health outcomes does require humility, does require not working within the medical institutions, not working within the institutions of science in the same way. And there are people doing that work, and it's very exciting work. And I think that, there's amazing people. I'm thinking right now, my friend Namonti Nankemo, who is a Warani activist from the Amazon in Ecuador. And she's one of these people who is a bridge. She's a bridger. She wants to take the best of what we can get from science and Western science, and she wants to take the best of what her ancestral knowledges have and create something that will help all people. Which means protect the Amazon and protect the web of life around them, and also offer gifts for other communities to reconnect who've lost those ways. What are those key elements and things that can help communities who've been so brutalized by colonization to reconnect and find their ways back to the plants and the medicines and the land in those formative ways where culture comes from. And so that's beautiful work, and it's been a real honor to witness that work, but that itself is not my work. My work is listening and learning from folks who want to share, and then also sharing what I know and seeing, like, are there ways to bridge? Are there ways to bring different sciences together to be of maximum benefit for the healing of people and the planet?
You work a lot with the concept of deep medicine, which I would love for you, if you can, to explain in a few words. And also, yes, if we're talking about medicine, if we're talking about health, it is about protecting and regenerating and enhancing this web of life with all that it entails. And I'm thinking about, when you start your curriculum in med school, those notions are not really there all the time. It feels more like if everything will try to kill you, and we just need to find ways of, putting a stop.
Beating it back with a stick. Yeah. That's a very colonial mentality, right? So it's like there's the self and the other, and you're out there to just like kill the other, subjugate the other, and protect the integrity of the self, the nation, the individual. And that's a very false notion. We know now with microbiome science, we know from so many different kinds of science that humans are part of the web of life, and that we require and we are completely dependent upon others for our health, for our well-being, for our wellness. Little microbes in our gut turn on and off our immune system as we develop, turn on and off the genes for our neurologic development, our endocrine development. So if we didn't have those beings inside us and on us, in us, around us, we would not be, developed. We would not have the kind of capacity to exist in health. And so deep medicine is an acknowledgement that health is really a phenomenon that emerges out of systems harmonizing well together. It specifically requires an analysis of power, an analysis of history and power, and in understanding how structures are set in place that predispose certain groups to poor health. And then it has a prescription to overturn those structures. So it's not simply navel gazing. It's not like, let's just look at what's wrong. It's not the social determinants of health, which has literally very, very little analysis of power, very little analysis of how things got to be the way they are. And in that lack of analysis of that, there is a tacit sense of inevitability that will always be the way it is. And so deep medicine, purposefully looks at this, overturning those structures of power so that health can be possible, so that systems can harmonize well together. So it's moving away from an individual focus on health to systems. And it's also, deep medicine is not something that doctors tend to practice. It's not something that medical practitioners know how to practice. It's actually people who are existing outside of medicine who are practicing really, really well. And I use like a great example here in East Oakland are formerly unhoused people of Poor Magazine who are building their own solutions to poverty. They are building their own housing, literally their own houses. They have their own redistribution of resources and food and sundries and things that people need, which has been critical during the pandemic and before. And they offer a teaching, a liberation schooling to those of us with race, class, institutional, educational, gender privilege. And so going to that people school, it's a 2-day event. I highly recommend it to everyone I know, is an incredible experience of deep medicine because you are listening to the lived experiences of people who have been crushed by the arrangements of power of our society, who share with you their humanity and invite you again into your humanity in the witnessing of it. So it's pulling from Bowles' Theater of the Oppressed, the pedagogies from those movements. And it's very powerful because in that you get to see yourself joined with someone who you might not ever encounter in that way, in an intimate discussion about the social forces that have led to someone being so deeply harmed. And so I have found that very, it just seems so simple, but it's so powerful. And yeah, so that's what deep medicine is. It's an analysis of power. It's a how that power makes structures, and then how you overturn those, how you overturn that, and then what happens then. It's like removing a dam from a river. You can see what happens to the toxic algae. You can see what happens to the temperature of the water. You can see what happens to the fish population. Everything gets better, which is exciting.
Yeah, and in a sense, also, visibilizing, I don't know if that's a word in English, but giving visibility to all the things that these power structures have enabled or destroyed, or how we are harvesting our food, or having these food deserts, or racial and gender discrimination, or what's happening in the Amazon, and giving that visibility comes with a deep sense also of, in a way, of death and grieving, because at the same time we have destroyed what we are. And I always think about the 5 stages or 6 stages of grief and grieving from Kubler-Ross, and how we are always negotiating between them with what we are seeing all the time that's happening in the health and death arenas.
Yes, I think that grieving is a really important part also of deep medicine, not just on our own, but collectively, that we take account of what we've lost, and that we have grieving rituals. Because in the acknowledgement of what has been lost, there's again a reclamation of our humanity, and a way of reintegrating and integrating into our bodies our experiences. So that we can hold a collective story, a collective narrative of what has happened, so that it does not continue to happen. And that is a very important part of this work.
Yes. And, talking about exactly what we have been exposed to, the exposome, and the chemistry and the social and the psychological and the ecological and the historical and political, but narrative and story are also a fundamental part of this exposome. And, you're an artist, and I think that at least now we realize that the work of artists as not changing, but at least showing new possibilities of our collective narratives are very important. They're not just entertainment or good art. They're needed for us to imagine ourselves as holobionts, as living ecosystems, as part of the same, I don't know how to call it, but the same.
Yeah, there's that adage that the eye does not see what the mind does not know. And the role of the artist is to craft those visions for us so that we can imagine what's possible. I'm sitting here in Oakland as a level 5, a category 5 storm is about to hit, which means impending loss of life. more destructive than anything. And we're in the calm right before the storm. And, just over the New Year's Eve, there were torrential downpours in San Francisco and Oakland, and people were flooded. And, well, I think one person died who was trapped in their car. And to me, there's, thousands of people on the street here. There are people living in tents. There's thousands of empty hotel rooms right now. Thousands of empty hotel rooms. And it is simply a lack of imagination that we've been like, oh, these people are just on the street, right? So like we just have not in our minds thought it was possible just to say, everyone get inside. And for me, during the pandemic, I thought, okay, this will be the moment we'll get everyone inside. It's like, nope, we left 8,000 people on the streets. Okay, now we have a pandemic and we have wildfires, and the air is so bad that it's toxic to human health. Now we're going to get everyone inside. Nope, we're not going to get everyone inside, because we can't imagine that, private property is less important than a life in this country. People serve 30 years in prison for stealing $200 in this country. That's why we have so many people in prison, because, we have enforced scarcities. We create these dynamics where we demonstrate over and over again that private property is more important than a human life. And to me, that's a huge tragedy, and that's a failure of our imagination. So what can artists do to help us imagine opening up those doors, taking all those vacant homes that are bought by Chinese investors that are sitting open here in Oakland, people who are coming here to diversify their real estate portfolios, right? They're coming here for using our homes as speculation in their capitalist investment strategies, means that there are mothers and children on the street. And we as people have not yet gotten the courage to go, Moms for Housing they're a group of women in Oakland who just took over a home. They just occupied it and took it over. But collectively as humans, we haven't reached the point of saying, that's actually wrong. That's the wrong calculation. We don't need to do that, because no life is less valuable than a hotel room belonging to some business. And that to me is, that's why art is so critical right now, is because the more people get pinched emotionally, the narrower the window becomes on their imagination. So in times of crisis, in times of war, in times of famine, in times of strife, climactic events, these pandemics, for me as an artist personally, it's been very hard to write, because I am in trauma. We're all in like shock and trauma. But this is actually when we need to write, because we need to help pry open the door for people to go, actually, that's just a hotel room. This is a mother and her child. Yes. This is a human being. And so that's where, the failure of imagining to like open the door and let the people in. The failure of imagining of doctors to organize politically to say we refuse to discharge these people to the streets. The failure of imagining of nurses and other people in the hospital to organize to say, we actually are not going to let you take away our masks. This is for our health. This is for our safety. We don't have the energy to organize or the energy to imagine right now. And that is critical, because there's so many things coming out at people all at the same time. That's the definition of a crisis. So this is absolutely the time we need our artists to step up.
Yeah, and yet in so much contradiction and loss and death and trauma, as you say, writing and talking about it and feeling those feelings, at some point it gives us our energy back.
It does.
At some point. So it's another leap of faith of really not knowing if you never know what happens after you launch yourself into deep grieving. You believe that it will extinguish you, but I guess that when we allow that, because we as a collective and in our Western societies, we We don't like death. We don't like grieving. So we are really illiterate in that things. But I see in ancestral wisdoms where they don't have so many resources to get distracted with, or their loss is so big that there's no other thing but to grieve. The amount of community, power, energy, ideas, creativity that comes out of it, it's outstanding.
Yeah.
So I think you became a mother in 2013. I became a father in 2014. And you've said that the coming of age of our children will be met with increasing frequency of catastrophic events. So our children are small now, in a sense, we could say, but they're not small. Never. So how to talk to them about these things without the usual rhetoric and the usual doomsday predictions that this will bring? Because at the end of the day, it's the world that they are inhabiting since they were born.
We're very real with our children. So we homeschool them, so we don't have to unindoctrinate them. We are on a farm where we're working with different communities to reconnect to the web of life and to each other. We are encouraging them to go into work that will heal people or heal the earth. And that's very natural. Like for my child who's now turning 10 this year, he is a naturally gifted engineer, electrical engineer, who believes we can create electricity out of the air. And he has been creating models for this since he was about 3 years old. He's been talking about, he calls it aircatricity. Nikola Tesla had a very similar idea. And so he's been studying and learning. But his whole thing is like, we have to find energy that won't hurt Mama Earth, that won't require us to mine, that won't require the subjugation of other people, that won't damage things, but that will be part of her gift to us that we can then use. So that's what his passion is. And he recognizes he has to learn how to find clean water, build a shelter, run away from wildfires, protect the air he breathes, grow food when he has to, protect the seeds. So there's all sorts of information he needs that he's learning that feels more relevant to me than him learning US history in schools. And it's great because then he brings his friends who are going to traditional schools to the farm, and then they're learning, and then they're learning from the land with him. And it's exciting. So he knows, we look at the data, okay, if we're going to be up at 2.5 degrees of warming in your lifetime, and to come back down to 1.5 will take your entire life. This is what your life is going to look like. So how do we create the microclimates? How do we create the refugias for farming? How do we create a place to protect the seeds, protect the water? How do we create the kinds of relationships we need within our communities to create, to heal and move forward in a collaborative way? How do we take the best of what we know from our Indigenous partners and friends to, scientists like my son? And how do they work together? And that's the future. So for us, it's exciting. The problem is always an opportunity. And so it's scary as shit as a parent. You just like wake up sometimes with terror. But it's also, this is what time it is. You can't deny it. You can't, I could stick my kid in a school, but I would probably have more anxiety if I did that because I know they wouldn't be learning what they actually need to learn. And when we talk with some of our Native friends up north at the base of Mount Shasta, there's a leader up there who's in his 30s, and he's like, how do we start using social media and the metaverse and these things and VR to start conveying these ideas out there, because people need to know, and people need find a way back to these cultural perspectives that require that earth is treated as a sacred being. And so that's interesting and exciting to me to think of how people are all problem solving this from the grassroots, and that's where the most exciting and innovative solutions are coming.
Yes. And I believe that also giving them experiences of the sacredness of the world is not only telling them that the world is sacred and life is sacred, but, you know, if we spend our time watching Netflix and going to big supermarkets, I think we lose that sense of sacredness in a sense.
Well, this is what Palm, who is such an interesting visionary leader of the Winnemem Wintu, says, that, you know, we actually have to put the sacred in those spaces, because people are there. And if they're there and they're not seeing it, then they're lost, right? But if they see it, or they find a little hook that'll bring them to it, that's why it's necessary to be in those spaces, which I thought was a very interesting thing. I didn't think of that. And I think it's a very powerful leading way of trying to bring people back to some very core practices and principles that will secure and guarantee our wellness in the future. Yeah,
as long as those things don't transform into businesses, you know, that they are extracting your money in exchange of those sacred experiences. So you were a few months ago in COP27. This is a big conference. Can you tell me, how was it, and what do you think about these multidisciplinary, huge events to talk about the future of the planet?
Well, that's where I was hanging out with Palm from the Winnemem Wintu. So for that, it was great. It was great to meet and be with activists from around the world. But we can do that in other places. COP27, I call it a trade show for the end of the world. So it's capitalists who are looking like how to scramble to make money as the planet's on fire.
Wow.
There was not, you know, there were no people there really, except for the activists, really articulating solutions. There were no governments or industries, because those governments and industries are very committed to the capitalist project, which is unfortunate because that's what's destroying our planet. So I found it farcical. I found it a waste of time, except for connecting with activists. But I could like literally drive up to Shasta in 3 hours and go connect with them up there. But it was, you know, it was important to hear about the beautiful work happening at the Klamath River here in California, where the tribes are removing the dam and allowing the run of salmon to come back, and also reestablishing the weather, the temperature patterns of that river in a way that benefits the health of the entire ecosystem. So it was good to celebrate those things there. But really, COP27 was a joke in that way.
Okay. Well, I would love thank you so much for, you know, it's been amazing to share with you, and I'm really inspired by what you do. Last night I was watching you on YouTube on your video when you are all painted in blue and rapping and talking about glyphosate. It's amazing. What's your next song about, your next album about?
Well, as we were having this conversation, I'm looking at my guitar and I was like, man, I should just really write a song about opening up the damn doors to the hotels because there's a storm coming. So I think right when we get off this, I'm going to pick up my guitar and just start writing that song, because that is what it is about. It's like, okay, can we write a song that can help people imagine? You're not seeing the problem correctly. You know, you're not locating the pathology in the right spot. You're just going to sit there complaining about all these people on the street, but you're not seeing like there's actually something we could be doing. So that's probably my next song, and I'll just write it right when we get off this call.
If you end up recording it, please send it to me, and I'll put it in the show notes so that everyone can hear it.
Sounds good.
And sing along.
That sounds great.
Rupa, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation, and I really I'm inspired by your work. I loved your book, In Flame, which I also put a link on the show notes. And my last question would be, this podcast is heard by many aspiring physicians or doctors who are already practicing, and they are hearing this song that we're singing, and they want to sing too. What would you say to them?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Victor, for being so patient with me because things have been so busy. I think that this song is a song that has to be sung by all of us if we want it to really have impact. I think that doctors, young physicians, healthcare workers are starting to really recognize the harms and limitations of modern medicine. And that the places where we can learn the best are in our local communities with the people who are practitioners of deep medicine. So for me here, that's people like I mentioned, Tiny Gray Garcia of Poor Magazine. That is people like our friend Karina Gould, who's Ohlone, who's doing work with Land Back with Sugorte Land Trust. That is my fellow farmers and doctors and healers with the Deep Medicine Circle. So that's like, find the groups in your community who can teach you about what it looks like to change structures of power that are hurting people in ways that can advance health, and then learn from them and then see what that does to you. And that's it. That's basically it. That's where I'd start. And then you're going to be on a lifelong journey that will just be the most awesome thing, and will also prepare you for what's coming, which is mass migrations of human beings, which is mass destruction from weather events, and which is the need for us all to be more prepared to take care of one another.
Thank you so much, Rupa, and hope we stay in touch and we continue co-creating together.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day and good luck with the storm.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nos encantaría recibir tu retroalimentación de estos podcasts para continuar generando contenidos que te sean útiles e interesantes. Si puedes, déjanos un comentario en la página web victorsaadia.com.